The autumn air of October 2015 carried a sharp chill in Washington, D.C., the kind of chill that reminded those in power that winter was coming, a season of stillness, of waiting, of endurance. Inside the Capitol, in a quiet government office reinforced with security, John Brennan sat alone. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency was not a man easily startled. His life was spent guiding shadows, navigating dangers that stretched across continents. But on this particular afternoon, something pierced that composure. The shrill sound of his personal phone, not the secure line, not the office extension. His personal cell phone, a device known to only a few. The number glowing on the screen was unfamiliar, the digits unremarkable. To a man in his position, an unknown number was often nothing more than noise. But habit, or perhaps a flicker of unease, made him answer. "Hello?" Brennan's voice was even, controlled, the practiced calm of a man used to staring down crises. A young voice came back, faint, distorted, carried on the static of the line. "Hello, John Brennan." The use of his name was deliberate, invasive, an assertion of power. Brennan's posture stiffened, though his tone did not waver. "Who is this?" The voice laughed lightly, a cruel sort of amusement, like a child dangling a secret they weren't supposed to know. Then the words came, "You're getting Luthered." The phrase was nonsense, yet laced with menace. Brennan's mind moved quickly, running through possibilities, code phrases, internal leaks, the ramblings of a prankster. He didn't have the luxury of dismissal. He pressed harder. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" The laugh returned, sharper now, more arrogant. It was so. "Easy, bro. You're such a dumb." The voice trailed off, replaced by more laughter. This was no ordinary prank. Brennan could feel it. A man in his position knew better than most how fragile privacy really was. Every secret, every weakness, could be turned into a weapon. He asked again, this time with steel in his voice. "What do you want?" The answer was immediate, casual, as though spoken by someone with nothing to lose. "I don't want anything." "I already own you." Brennan pushed back. "How much do you want?" The question was instinct, training. Extortion followed patterns, and even in absurdity, there was often a clue to motive. But the voice on the other end had no interest in patterns. "We want $5 trillion. The number was absurd, intentionally so. Then came the true demand, spoken with chilling simplicity. "We want you to stop bombing the Middle East." For a moment, silence filled the line. The request wasn't about money. It wasn't about leverage. It was political, ideological, the kind of demand no CIA director could ever meet. Across the Atlantic, in a small bedroom in the West Midlands of England, a teenager leaned back in his gaming chair, the phone still in his hand. The smell of cannabis lingered in the air. His heart raced. He had just called the director of the CIA and walked away unscathed. He called himself Crocker. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't an agent of a foreign government. He was a teenager with a cheap phone, an internet connection, and more arrogance than caution. In that moment, laughing into the receiver, he felt untouchable. He felt powerful. He had christened his group Crackers with Attitude. And with that single call, he had declared war on one of the most secretive institutions in the world. To the CIA, the call was a breach of security, an embarrassment, a threat. To Crocker, it was a joke, a thrill, an experiment in chaos. But history would prove that it was the opening act of something far larger. Something neither Brennan nor Crocker fully understood. A collision between the most powerful intelligence, agency in the world, and a group of angry, reckless teenagers armed only with computers. 7 years earlier, in 2008 Virginia, another teenager was discovering his own path into the digital underground. He called himself Default. On the surface, he was ordinary, an American kid with a love of soccer, a collection of video games, and the companionship of a loyal dog. He lived in a quiet suburb, in the rhythms of school, home, and the occasional clash with his father, a man whose world was governed by order and rules. But beneath that surface, Default's life was shifting. His first taste of power didn't come from sports or academics. It came from a cheat code, a simple line of text that bent the logic of a video game to his will. That small act of control was intoxicating. It showed him that systems, even the ones that seemed fixed, could be manipulated, reshaped, broken. And once he had seen that, he couldn't stop. He began to study the language of computers, not just how to use them, but how to make them obey. Nights disappeared into glowing screens. Tutorials, forums, and obscure corners of the internet became his textbooks. Every exploit he learned was a door opening into a hidden world. The timing was perfect. Anonymous, the hacktivist collective, was exploding into public consciousness. Their Guy Fawkes masks, their distorted voices, their grand proclamations of rebellion against injustice, they captivated him. Citizens of the world, the voices intoned in viral videos. To a restless teenager, they were digital superheroes, fighting governments and corporations from the shadows. Default dabbled. He began by probing random websites, testing doors, seeing which locks would give way. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about curiosity, control, and the thrill of proving that he could. Each success was invisible, known only to him, but it filled him with the heady rush of power. But the more time he spent in anonymous chat rooms, the more the mystique dissolved. Behind the mask was dysfunction. Paranoia ruled. Federal agents and informants lurked in the shadows. Infighting was constant. Arrests were frequent. What had seemed like a sleek movement of digital warriors was instead a chaotic swarm, bloated by attention, corrupted by exposure. Default grew disillusioned. He wanted focus, purpose, precision. He found it in a splinter group called AnonSec. Smaller, sharper, more disciplined, AnonSec didn't waste time on trolling or theatrics. Their operations were calculated, their targets deliberate. Here, Default honed his craft. AnonSec controlled the botnet, a silent army of infected computers around the world, waiting for commands. Default explored the territories they had conquered, navigating digital landscapes with growing confidence. That was when he stumbled into a server belonging to Windsor University, a Canadian medical school. He didn't just gain access. He reached the financial core. Student records lay before him, millions of dollars in debt entries, each one a weight on someone's future. At the bottom of the screen, one button glowed with a forbidden promise. Delete all. His finger hovered. He imagined the students, shackled by loans that would take decades to repay. He thought of his dog, so loyal, so free of the cruelty of human systems. He thought of the absurdity of a world where young people were born into debt before they even began their lives. And then he pressed it. With a few keystrokes, $9.4 million in debt was erased. No one saw it happen. No one heard it. But to default, the act reverberated like an earthquake. He wasn't a vandal. He wasn't a thief. He was a liberator. He had used his skills not for profit, but for justice, or at least what he believed was justice. That moment became his compass. His hacks would not be for money, not for chaos. They would be acts of rebellion against systems he saw as unjust. Anonymous had inspired him, but Anonsec gave him tools. Now, he was ready to wield them. The mid-2010s were a crucible of tension, mistrust, and upheaval. The promise of the internet as a tool of liberation had curdled into a weapon of control. Governments, shaken by the revelations of Edward Snowden, were scrambling to rebuild trust even as they expanded their surveillance powers. And on the streets, in cities from Baltimore to Ferguson, people shouted their rage at systems they believed were built to keep them down. The Black Lives Matter movement had exploded across America after the deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray. Demonstrations surged through urban centers, filled with chants, placards, raised fists, and a constant refrain: justice. Every protest brought cameras, and every camera brought new videos of tear gas, rubber bullets, and heavily armored police confronting crowds of citizens. The internet amplified the images until they circled the globe, a cycle of outrage and sorrow feeding on itself day by day. For young people watching from their bedrooms, glued to screens, it felt like the world was breaking open. Governments claimed to represent freedom while deploying militarized police against protesters. Officials demanded loyalty while building ever larger databases of their citizens' lives. To many teenagers searching for a sense of purpose, the hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Online communities gave those teenagers a voice. Twitter hashtags became rallying cries. Anonymous message boards swelled with digital flyers, lists of police misconduct, leaked documents meant to embarrass the powerful. Hacktivism was no longer a fringe pursuit. It was entwined with the culture of rebellion, inseparable from the fight for justice in the streets. In Denmark, activists battled on another front. The nation had become one of the last in Europe to permit bestiality, and the grotesque reality of animal brothels drew international condemnation. Online pressure mounted, petitions spread, and images of suffering animals circulated. Activists took to Twitter, Reddit, and forums, calling out lawmakers and demanding change. Digital campaigns turned outrage into legislative momentum. These events stitched together a global mood of defiance. Whether it was racial injustice in America, animal rights in Europe, or mass surveillance everywhere, the common thread was distrust of authority. For default, the American teenager, and Crocker, the British boy, this backdrop was formative. It wasn't just about pranks or proving their skill. It was about living in a world where injustice was visible, constant, undeniable, and where the traditional channels for change seemed slow, corrupt, or broken. The screen in front of them became more than entertainment. It became a battlefield. Across the Atlantic, in a modest British town, another boy sat surrounded by the glow of monitors. His world was not polished or orderly. His room was littered with half-empty soda cans, the air dense with cigarette smoke, clothes strewn across the floor. The chaos suited him. He thrived in it. He called himself Crocker. Where default sought order and justice, Crocker chased adrenaline. He was the embodiment of recklessness, sharp-witted, crude, and endlessly restless. His sense of humor was cutting, his patience non-existent. But beneath the sarcasm burned a vein of genuine rage. Rage at governments, at police, at the endless news feeds of war and injustice. For Kraka, the Palestinian struggle was personal. He wasn't Palestinian. He had never been to Gaza or the West Bank. But the images that filled his social media, rubble, bloodied children, wailing mothers, lit a fire in him. He saw the bombs falling, the lopsided balance of power, and he couldn't sit still. He wanted to strike back any way he could. At first, it was small-time mischief. Vandalizing local websites, mocking school administrators, planting rude jokes in forgotten corners of the internet. But it wasn't enough. He craved bigger targets, bigger humiliations. That hunger led him to a chat room one night where he crossed paths with Default. Their first conversation was brief. Kraka was brash, impatient, hurling insults half seriously, testing the waters. Default, older and calmer, responded with a measured confidence that only deepened Kraka's curiosity. Here was someone who didn't just talk, he had done things. Real things. Erased debts, changed laws. It was an unlikely partnership. The disciplined coder and the volatile joker. The philosopher and the brawler. But almost immediately, they recognized the potential in each other. Default provided structure, vision, and technical mastery. Kraka provided audacity, fearlessness, and the kind of chaotic energy that could push them beyond the ordinary. Late into the night, their chats stretched into hours. They spoke of politics, of injustice, of the suffocating surveillance systems that blanketed the world. They ranted about leaders who ruled with impunity and governments who claimed to protect while spying on their own people. It was in these conversations that a new idea began to take shape. Not just another hack, not just another prank. Something bigger. They would strike not at a corporation, not at a university, not at a minor government office. They would strike at the heart of American intelligence itself. Their eyes turned toward John Brennan, the director of the CIA, the man who embodied the surveillance state, the architect of drone warfare, the keeper of secrets that spanned the globe. If they could get to him, they reasoned, they could prove to the world that no one was untouchable. The plan was born in laughter, but beneath the jokes lay a seriousness neither admitted outright. They were about to poke a hornet's nest unlike any other. On the surface, John Brennan's defenses were impenetrable. His office was layered with security clearances, his communications encrypted, his movements shielded by protocol. But like many powerful men, Brennan carried a weakness. The ordinary parts of his life. Buried in an unassuming database was a quiet thread of information. His Comcast account, his AOL InMail, personal details handled not by CIA technicians, but by regular customer service reps, people trained to handle billing issues, not counterintelligence warfare, and this was where Kraka excelled. Unlike Default, who thrived on technical exploits, Kraka specialized in social engineering. He could talk his way into almost anything. Armed with charm, mockery, and a willingness to lie without hesitation, he treated companies like stage plays, with every call a performance. One October afternoon, he dialed Verizon. Posing as a technician, he claimed to be locked out of an account, rattling off Brennan's name with casual confidence. At first, the rep hesitated. Security protocols demanded more. But Kraka had prepared. Using fragments of publicly available data, combined with a voice that exuded authority, he bypassed one checkpoint after another. And then, in an instant, the door opened. Brennan's personal anonymous account, a relic from the early days of the internet, was his golden key. Inside were not just family photos or grocery lists, but attachments he should never have left unguarded. Documents containing sensitive intelligence, including drafts of policy papers, clearance forms, even discussions on the CIA's controversial interrogation program. Kraka stared at the trove, stunned by its simplicity. Here was the director of the CIA, undone not by a zero-day exploit or a sophisticated malware campaign, but by a teenager with a phone. The breach was intoxicating. He immediately reached out to Default, his voice crackling with excitement over the headset. "Bro, we've got him. We've actually got him." Default, more cautious, warned him not to rush. But even he felt the gravity of what they had accomplished. This wasn't vandalism. This was history. They began leaking the documents in waves, each carefully chosen to maximize embarrassment. Drafts of intelligence briefings, sensitive contacts, even Brennan's own application for his security clearance. The media seized upon it, headlines screaming that the CIA director's personal email had been hacked. The symbolism was devastating. If Brennan could be breached, who was safe? From the outside, the world imagined a shadowy foreign adversary, perhaps Russian intelligence, perhaps Chinese operatives. Few could believe the truth, that it was a teenager in Britain, working from a cluttered bedroom, fueled by little more than cigarettes, soda, and spite. Kraka basked in the chaos. He taunted Brennan's contacts, prank-called his colleagues, even boasted to journalists under the banner of a new name, Kraka's with Attitude. The group was small, just a handful of hackers loosely orbiting Kraka and Default, but the name itself was a weapon. It was ridiculous, provocative, impossible to ignore. And it was now plastered across the headlines of every major news outlet. But with every headline came escalation. The FBI was mobilized. Intelligence agencies scrambled. The walls around Brennan tightened. And somewhere in the shadows, new names began whispering across the wires. The Krakas weren't done yet. Back in that smoke-filled bedroom in England, the boy who had taunted John Brennan with a prank call felt like he had just lit a fuse under the most powerful empire in the world. His online alias was Kraka, and in his mind, this was only the beginning. He wasn't satisfied with one audacious stunt. He wanted something bigger, something lasting, a banner that the world would remember. So he christened his new group with a deliberately provocative name, Krakas with Attitude. It was cheeky, defiant, and meant to send a message that these hackers weren't afraid of anyone. They were kids, yes, but kids who could humiliate the mightiest intelligence agencies on Earth. At first, it was just him. But soon, the group began to attract attention. Among the first to join was Default, the disillusioned American teenager who had already tasted the thrill of digital rebellion through Anonymous and AnonSec. Default had admired Kraka's audacity, the way he turned a Google search and a smooth-talking phone call into an exploit that reached the inbox of the CIA director himself. It was, in a strange way, art. The two bonded instantly. Oceans apart, but united by ideology and adrenaline, they stayed up through long nights, typing furiously across encrypted chat rooms. They spoke of justice, of rage, of a desire to make the hidden masters of the surveillance state feel what ordinary citizens felt every day, powerless and exposed. Their methods were not the sophisticated, technical wizardry Hollywood might imagine. They weren't writing zero-day exploits or breaking encryption protocols. Instead, they relied on something far more human, social engineering, a phone call to a help desk worker, a fabricated story about a lost password, the ability to sound just credible enough to convince a stranger to hand over a PIN code. With each successful trick, they proved that the weak link in even the most secure systems was not the computer, but the person operating it. Their first major target after Brennan was James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence. Crockett discovered that Clapper's information was shockingly easy to find. A few searches, some persistence, and he had Clapper's home address, his phone number, his email account. Posing as a technician, he called Clapper's internet service provider and managed to seize control of his account. The result was equal parts petty and profound. For several days, every call made to James Clapper's home phone was rerouted, not to his colleagues or his family, but to the Free Palestine movement. For Crockett, it was perfect, part activism, part mockery. He and Default laughed until their sides hurt, imagining Clapper's wife or staffers confused and irritated as their phone rang endlessly with political messages. And then, almost inevitably, they escalated. Once inside Clapper's accounts, they moved laterally. Default encouraged Crockett to dig deeper, to test just how fragile the walls of power really were. They wanted to prove a point, that the men who ran global intelligence empires were no safer from intrusion than anyone else. They wanted to show the world that secrecy was a myth. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about glory, not really. For Default, it was about principle. For Crockett, it was about rage. For both, it was about the intoxicating sense that from their bedrooms, cluttered with empty cans, dimly lit by glowing screens, they could strike at the very heart of the American government. And strike they did. By the autumn of 2015, Crackas with Attitude had turned from an obscure hacker crew into a genuine nightmare for Washington. What had begun with a single taunting phone call was now a campaign of harassment and humiliation aimed directly at the highest officials in the United States. The leaks came in rapid succession. First Brennan, then Clapper, then Jed Johnson, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and then, astonishingly, databases belonging to the FBI and Department of Justice themselves. Each new breach hit the headlines like a hammer. The public couldn't get enough of the story. Teenagers, barely old enough to vote, running circles around the most powerful intelligence infrastructure in the world. Newspapers reveled in the irony. Late-night comedians joked about how America's top spies couldn't even secure their email accounts. The agencies, meanwhile, were livid. For the Crackas, every new headline was validation. They laughed at the coverage, screenshotted news articles, and celebrated each other's exploits. Their Twitter accounts, brazen and taunting, became rallying points for a growing crowd of online supporters who cheered the humiliation of the surveillance state. But behind the humor was something darker. Among the files they had stolen were thousands of personal details, addresses, phone numbers, birth dates, even the names of family members of FBI agents. When those records were dumped online, the consequences were immediate. Agents reported threatening phone calls. Their spouses received harassing messages. Children's names appeared on websites frequented by hostile hackers. To the intelligence community, this was not just a nuisance anymore. This was a security risk. The lives of operatives and their families had been endangered. Some had to be relocated at great cost. Offices scrambled to implement emergency countermeasures. Suddenly, the CIA, FBI, and DHS weren't just worried about protecting secrets. They were worried about protecting people. Kraka seemed almost to revel in this fear. He gave interviews to reporters, his voice high-pitched and cocky, sneering at the very notion that these powerful men could protect themselves. "If the CIA director is so smart," he jeered, "why is he using it?" Oh. Default, though, was troubled. For him, the goal had been exposure, showing the hypocrisy of surveillance, pushing back against unchecked power. But now the line between activism and cruelty was blurring. Families were suffering. Innocent people, people who had no say in policy decisions, were becoming collateral damage in their digital war. The split between the two young hackers was subtle but growing. Kraka thrived on the chaos. Default brooded on its costs, but neither could stop the momentum. The Krakas had become a spectacle, a public drama too large to control. And in Washington, the response was swift. The FBI launched a dedicated task force to track the group. Agents combed through logs, subpoenas flew to telecom companies, and foreign partners were mobilized. London's Metropolitan Police, MI5, and GCHQ all received requests for cooperation. The British press began whispering about a teenage mastermind in the Midlands. American officials seethed at the thought that their national security had been undone not by enemy states, but by kids. The storm had broken. The Krakas had gone too far. And the hunt had begun. By early 2016, Krakas with attitude had reached their peak and their breaking point. Every headline, every leak, every triumphant tweet drew more attention, and with it, more pressure. The FBI was no longer investigating casually. They were hunting. Inside Washington, the humiliation was still raw. The personal details of FBI agents and their families had been spilled onto the open internet. Threats were pouring in from foreign actors, criminals, and opportunists who now had access to sensitive contact information. High-ranking officials were livid. They demanded answers, demanded action, demanded results. Behind the scenes, a massive multi-agency task force was assembled. Cyber forensic experts dug into logs. Telecom companies were subpoenaed. Internet service providers, email platforms, and chat services were pressured to provide metadata. The machinery of the state moved with singular focus. In Britain, intelligence services monitored chatter on dark web forums and encrypted platforms. Suspicious activity traced back to Midlands IP addresses began to narrow the field. The careless bravado of Kraka, the teenage ringleader, left trails of evidence he didn't realize he was leaving. His voice, captured in recorded prank calls to journalists, offered vocal patterns to compare. His digital fingerprint was becoming visible, even as he believed he was untouchable. Default, though more cautious, was not invisible either. The FBI pieced together fragments, time zones, typing patterns, linguistic quirks. They built psychological profiles, examining motivations, cross-referencing every post with open-source intelligence. The portrait sharpened, and still the Krakas pressed on. Every day they stayed active increased their risk. Kraka taunted the FBI on Twitter. Default tried to moderate his partner's recklessness, but he too was addicted to the rush. Together, they believed they could ride the wave forever. But the net was tightening. Surveillance warrants stacked up. Covert monitoring of communications intensified. Digital tripwires were set in place, waiting for a mistake. The turning point came with a single crucial slip. One of Kraka's calls was traced more directly than before. An operator noticed inconsistencies in his story, flagged the incident, and the logs were pulled. Location data revealed something shocking. The caller was not an enemy state, but a boy in the UK. From that moment, the operation moved at full speed. British police prepared raids. The FBI finalized its indictments. The days of mocking tweets and humiliating leaks were numbered. The hunters were closing in. For a time, Default believed his meticulous habits would save him. He had always prided himself on being the careful one, the cautious counterbalance to Kraka's recklessness. He rotated usernames, masked his traffic, and encrypted everything he touched. He avoided the limelight, never gave interviews, never boasted online the way Kraka did. If Kraka was the loud frontman, Default preferred to stay in the shadows, pulling the strings. But the FBI had time, resources, and patience. The embarrassment suffered by the CIA and FBI leadership had created an almost personal vendetta. To them, this wasn't simply about justice. It was about pride. Their reputations had been dragged through the mud by teenagers, and those teenagers had to be caught. Federal cybercrime units, with assistance from GCHQ and other international partners, traced every breadcrumb. Each login attempt, each slip in operational security, each careless moment was logged, cataloged, and followed. It didn't matter that Default used Tor and piggybacked on remote Wi-Fi. Patterns emerged, habits repeated. A digital fingerprint began to form. Still, it wasn't the machines that caught him. It was human weakness. One night, during a drunken gaming session, Default let his guard slip. Playing with friends over Xbox Live, he watched news reports scroll across the screen about the CIA hack. Fueled by alcohol and pride, he couldn't resist. Yeah, he slurred into his headset. That was us. He laughed, thinking it was nothing more than banter among friends. But the words stuck. His friend, harboring resentment over a personal betrayal, remembered them. And in time, he passed them along. That tiny fracture in his armor was all the FBI needed. The raid came just before dawn. Federal agents surrounded his family's suburban Virginia home, weapons drawn, commands booming through megaphones. His parents awoke to chaos, the windows filled with flashing red and blue, the air pierced by the sound of splintering wood as the front door gave way. Default, barely 17, sat in his room as agents stormed in. His computer was in mid-decryption, still vulnerable. For 30 minutes each startup, his fortress of encryption was open. And it was during that window that the FBI struck. Technicians rushed forward, flash copying hard drives, scooping up devices before they could lock. He was dragged from his chair, pressed to the floor, handcuffed, and marched past his stunned family. His neighbors watched from their porches as the teenager they thought they knew, quiet, studious, ordinary, was stuffed into a waiting van. The arrest shook him. In the back of the vehicle, staring at the steel divider, he realized the game was over. The double life he had lived for years had collapsed in a single morning. No more secrets, no more control. Just the slow machinery of the justice system grinding into motion. The trials of the Krakas were not just legal proceedings. They were public spectacles. In the United States, Default's case drew heavy coverage. Journalists packed the courtroom, eager to see the face of the boy who had humiliated the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. He appeared in a plain shirt, shackles around his wrists and ankles, looking far younger than the monstrous figure painted in headlines. His parents sat stiffly behind him, their expressions a mix of fear, anger, and grief. The prosecution wasted no time framing him as a threat to national security. They spoke in sharp, cutting tones about the millions of dollars spent to relocate intelligence officers and their families, the terror inflicted upon FBI agents whose private information had been leaked. They read aloud mocking statements from online chats, presenting him as unrepentant, dangerous, and emboldened by the chaos he caused. Default's defense painted a different picture. They described a teenager disillusioned by government lies, a boy swept into a digital subculture larger than himself. They emphasized his idealism, his desire to fight injustice, his immaturity. But against the backdrop of international embarrassment, the arguments rang hollow. Few in that courtroom were willing to show mercy. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. 5 years in federal prison. Default closed his eyes. He had prepared himself for this, but the finality of those words struck him like a blow. 5 years meant an entire chapter of his youth erased. College years are lost. Early adulthood gone. The sound of the gavel felt like the slamming of a cell door. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Kraka's trial unfolded in the UK. His age made his case different, but the tone was no less severe. British prosecutors described him as the ringleader, the voice behind the taunts, the face of humiliation. For weeks, evidence was laid out. Recordings of calls, screenshots of stolen data, testimony from cybersecurity experts. In the gallery, reporters scribbled notes. Parents whispered. Teachers from his school read about their student in disbelief. He was no longer just a teenager. He was the first minor in Britain to be charged with hacking crimes of this scale. The verdict came swiftly. 2 years in a juvenile detention facility. A punishment meant to reform, but also to send a clear message. Age would not be a shield from consequence. The trials closed one chapter of the Kraka saga, but for the boys at the center of it, the story was only beginning. Prison awaited, with all the silence, monotony, and reflection it would bring. Prison stripped away everything. The aliases, the glowing screens, the adrenaline of the hack. For Default and Kraka, incarceration was a new world, one where their skills meant little, and their reputations carried more weight than they wanted. Default's facility was stark and unforgiving. Days blurred together in routines of head counts, meal times, and enforced silence. He kept his head down, avoiding trouble where he could. But his mind never stopped racing. He thought constantly about the encrypted hard drive the FBI had seized, the one holding over 1,000 Bitcoin. At the time, it had been a curiosity. Now, it was worth millions, and it was gone. A fortune locked away in an evidence locker just beyond his reach. Nights were the hardest. He lay awake replaying the raid, the voices shouting, the cold weight of handcuffs. He remembered the rush of deleting $9 million in student debt with a single keystroke, the pride he had felt when Denmark outlawed bestiality after his campaign, the laughter shared with Kraka during their wildest nights online. But those memories soured as he thought of the FBI families targeted, the fear in their voices. The moral certainty he once clung to had crumbled. In its place was only doubt. Kraka's detention in the UK was different, but no less punishing. Juvenile facilities were noisy, chaotic, filled with young offenders who fought to prove themselves. To some, Kraka was a celebrity, the boy who hacked America, the rebel who taunted the CIA. To others, he was just another inmate, another target to challenge. He learned quickly to guard his words, to keep his head low, to navigate the volatile pecking order. But even in detention, his bravado flickered. Sometimes, late at night, he admitted to himself the fear he had buried under layers of arrogance. He thought of the day officers stormed his house, of his mother's tears, of the look on his father's face as he was led away. He remembered the adrenaline of rerouting James Clapper's phone calls, but he also remembered the dread of realizing that the FBI, an ocean away, still had the power to reach into his small suburban life. For both boys, the years in confinement became a crucible. They entered as cocky teenagers, armed with keyboards and righteous fury. They emerged older, quieter, scarred. And through it all, one question echoed endlessly in their minds. Had it been worth it? When the sentences were served, when the prison doors finally opened, the story of crackers with attitude was far from over. The hacks themselves had lasted only months. The consequences stretched into years, and the legacy stretches still further, into the uncertain future of digital rebellion. For Kraka, release meant freedom but not anonymity. He was no longer a faceless teenager hiding behind a screen name. He was the boy who hacked the CIA director, the child prodigy turned criminal. Every job application, every attempt to build a new life would carry that shadow. Some admired him as a folk hero, a digital Robin Hood who embarrassed the powerful. Others dismissed him as a reckless vandal who put lives in danger. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Default's path was heavier. His conviction, his prison sentence, and the seizure of his hard drives marked him for life. He would never again be just another young man from Virginia. To the FBI, he would always be a line in a case file, a name attached to one of the most humiliating episodes in agency history. To fellow hackers, he remained a cautionary tale, brilliant but flawed, idealistic but careless, principled yet crushed by the weight of his own methods. But the Krake's legacy was bigger than either of them. Their actions forced governments to admit vulnerabilities they had long ignored. They revealed, in embarrassing detail, that top officials used insecure services, failed to follow basic protocols, and underestimated the risks of human error. The hacks sparked new investments in cybersecurity, new training for personnel, and a sobering realization. The greatest dangers might not come from enemy states with billion-dollar budgets, but from angry kids with laptops. And for the broader culture of hacktivism, the Krakas became both an inspiration and a warning. To some, they proved that anyone, no matter how young or inexperienced, could strike at the heart of power. To others, they showed the futility of fighting the state, because no matter how high you fly, the government will always drag you back down. In classrooms and conference halls, their story became a case study. Professors in cybersecurity courses lectured about their social engineering techniques. Activists debated whether their methods crossed moral lines. Journalists revisited the saga in long-form podcasts and documentaries, turning their tale into a parable of the digital age. And yet, the deeper question remained unresolved. Were the Krakas villains who endangered innocent lives? Or were they flawed heroes, channeling the anger of a generation betrayed by institutions of power? The answer may never be simple. But what their story proves, what lingers long after the headlines have faded, is that the balance of power in the digital era is fragile. Governments hold vast resources, but individuals, even children, can shake their foundations with little more than audacity and persistence. The saga of Krakas with attitude is not just the story of two boys. It is the story of our age, A time when the line between justice and chaos blurs, when the powerless can challenge the powerful, and when the world's most closely guarded secrets can be undone with a single phone call. And as long as that remains true, their legacy will haunt every server room, every intelligence office, every agency that dares to believe it cannot be breached.